Hello viewers and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we're talking about the Peach State, Georgia. Georgia is the state that gave us Coca-Cola, Delta Airlines, and Chick-fil-A. The capital and largest city, Atlanta, has the largest aquarium in the world with over 100,000 different sea specimens. The state also has recently become a hotbed for movie and television production. Actually, a lot of recent media has been filmed in the Atlanta area, due in part to major tax incentives offered to production companies. So Atlanta has, in its own way, sort of become like the Hollywood of the Southeast. I also recently learned about another weird law. I love telling you about these. Apparently in the town of Gainesville, Georgia, it is illegal to eat chicken with a fork. In fact, a woman was jokingly arrested for committing that very heinous crime recently, but it was less of a serious arrest and more of a sort of prank and a publicity stunt, I guess, for the restaurant she was in. Georgia has 14 congressional House districts, and the current balance of power is 8 Republicans to 4 Democrats to 2 vacancies. Georgia's 5th opened up recently after the passing of the late, great John Lewis, who was very well known for marching alongside Martin Luther King during the height of the Civil Rights Movement. His district covers Atlanta and is widely expected to remain in Democratic control this year as well. The other vacancy is in Georgia's 14th district, which is in the northwestern part of the state, and an uncontested Republican candidate, Marjorie Taylor Greene, is obviously going to win this year as no one's running against her. Her Democratic opponent dropped out. There are actually 2 districts that I would consider to be moderately competitive in Georgia this year, and they are Georgia's 6th and 7th. But first, let's take a bit of a closer look at how Georgian voters have been trending and how they elect their representatives statewide by pulling up a line graph right now. And here's your line graph, and I have been waiting to show you guys this one for a very long time. This, Georgia, very possibly is the greatest example of the blue wave that swept through this country 2 years ago. And we have very predictable outcomes going back all the way to 2010 with peaks during presidential years and dips during midterm years that have been favoring Republicans generally, going from 2010 to 2016, but looking to 2018, we see Democrats actually turning out in higher numbers, raw turnout numbers for House candidates than they ever had previously at any point in this decade. Republicans also outperformed their previous numbers from other midterm cycles. However, they did drop off from their raw turnout numbers in 2016. It's always crazy when a party outperforms presidential year numbers during a midterm year, and that's exactly what Democrats did here in 2018, 2 years ago. Very impressive showing from the Georgian Democratic Party, and one has to wonder how that is going to affect this year's outcomes. So let's toss that graph aside, and we are talking about, I told you, Georgia's 6th and 7th right now. Both districts cover very heavily suburban areas north of Atlanta, the type of demographics that have been shifting pretty dramatically leftward recently, as evidenced by the blue wave of 2018. Freshman Democrat Lucy McBath is running for a second term in Georgia's 6th this year, and I do expect her to maintain control of that district this year as well. I do believe the type of people in her district are going to break for her pretty comfortably. As I said, it's a very heavily suburban district, and those types of places have been breaking for Democrats recently. Georgia's 7th is represented by Republican Congressman Rob Woodall, who is not running for a 6th term this year, so it is an open seat. That is a district that I do think will flip from Republican to Democrat this year, because it is so very similar to the makeup, the type of people that live in Georgia's 6th, which did flip 2 years ago, and based on the trajectory we've seen that has been favoring Democrats very clearly recently, I do think we're going to see a net gain of 1 for Democrats in the state of Georgia this year in the U.S. House. So let's make that result official and put it on our first map right now. Mark it. Up next, we have 2 Senate elections in Georgia. We're having 1 regularly scheduled Senate election and a special election. The special election comes as a result of the early retirement of former Senator Johnny Isakson, and the victor of that special election this year will will finish his term into 2022, when they will be up for re-election just 2 years later. First, let's talk about the regular election. Republican incumbent Senator David Perdue is running for a second term this year, and he's being challenged from the left by Democratic challenger John Ossoff. To get an idea of how Georgians have been electing senators over the years, let's pull up some voter turnout ratios right now. And here we have some pretty interesting numbers, pretty telling numbers actually. Basically, the Democratic senatorial candidates have never fallen below 100% going back over the last 10 years, and Republican candidates have only risen above 100% once, just barely in 2014, and in fact, that candidate was David Perdue during his first run. So 6 years ago in 2014, when he ran for the first time, he had a deficit of over 20 percentage points in voter turnout ratios against his Democratic opponent, meaning that the Democratic candidate for Senate received more votes than the total of all votes cast for Democratic House candidates in Georgia, whereas David Perdue received almost exactly the same amount of votes as the total of all Republican House candidates running in the state that year. Overall, we see Democratic senatorial candidates with an enthusiasm advantage going back over the last 10 years in the state, something that will be playing against David Perdue's chances this year. But now let's toss those numbers aside. Lastly, we do have to consider the approval rating of the incumbent. In this case, it is Senator Perdue, and he is actually at plus 23 points in the state of Georgia right now, which is pretty extraordinary for a sitting senator in a state as increasingly competitive as Georgia has become. This is a factor that will definitely play into his favor this year. So he has the disadvantage in voter turnout ratios. He has the advantage in approval rating. One just has to wonder with projected raw House turnout how he will fare this year in a matchup against newcomer John Ossoff. So for that, we can turn to Pollbot, give him all the numbers to calculate who's going to win the regular Senate election in Georgia this year. Pollbot. Okay, and there's your result. We've projected that David Perdue is going to go on to a second term this year by a 12.9% margin of victory. Honestly, viewers, I think this is a little high. John Ossoff has actually been polling much better than this. Matchups with him and Perdue in polling averages is much closer to 0 than 12, like we've projected here today. But unfortunately, those polls are not considered by our model that we use here for our predictions. So those type matchups are not really going to be reflected in our result here today. I do expect Perdue to win. Not by this much, though. It'll be much closer. It'll probably be single digits that he will go on to a second term. Okay, now we do have a second election here, and I need to explain a little bit about how this is going to work. It's actually, there's 4 candidates in the race. Sitting Senator Kelly Loeffler, who was appointed by Governor Kemp to finish out Isaacson's term through 2020 anyway, is in the race. She is being challenged from within her own party by Representative Doug Collins, another Republican. And then from the left, we also have the Reverend Raphael Warnock, a Democrat, and Democrat Matt Lieberman in a 4-way race to finish out this regular term for Senate. Like I said, whoever wins the election this year will go on, will carry the term through 2022, at which point they will be up for election again in a regular Senate election. But the victor of this race has to receive 50% of the vote, and in a 4-way race, that is very unlikely to happen next week. So what would happen is the top 2 performing candidates in the race will go on to a runoff after the fact, and whoever wins the majority or more votes in that race will become the next senator. Like I said, very unlikely to have more than 50% for any one candidate next week. But and we're also not considering any approval ratings in this race, even though Loeffler is technically an incumbent. I haven't found any reliable approval rating values for her, so we're unfortunately not going to be able to consider that. We're just going to be looking at expected raw turnout numbers at the House level versus those voter turnout ratios that slightly favor Democrats at the senatorial level. So let's give all that to Pollbot to calculate first if anyone's going to get 50% in this first race. Pollbot. Aha, and the answer is no. No candidate of the 4 will reach 50% on November 3rd, which means that the top 2 performing candidates will be going into a runoff. And based on polling data, which I hesitate to use, but I kind of have to in this case, the top 2 performing candidates would be Kelly Loeffler from the right and the Reverend Raphael Warnock from the left. So in a matchup of those 2 candidates in a runoff election, Pollbot, how is that likely to go? And there's your answer. It is Raphael Warnock, the Democrat, who recently got a very important endorsement from President Obama, which cranked up his numbers in polling significantly after that fact. Numbers are just going in Democrats' favor this year at the senatorial level, at the House level, and the senatorial level for Democrats in Georgia. And I do think Warnock will outperform Ossoff this year as he is up against a much weaker candidate. Perdue is generally approved of, and Loeffler is not. She's actually even had a bit of controversy in her very brief Senate career already. So this would be another flip in Democrats' favor, the second flip beyond the necessary 50 that they would need to flip the Senate away from Mitch McConnell's grasp. So let's make this result official now. One more seat gained for Democrats in the Senate coming from the state of Georgia. Let's put that on our senatorial map right now. Mark it. Now it is time to talk about the presidential race of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden. Georgia is a state that last voted for a Democratic presidential candidate in 1992 when they broke for Bill Clinton over George H.W. Bush. The state more recently did vote for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton by about a 5.2% margin of victory, narrowing up from the margin of victory in 2012, which was about 8% for Mitt Romney. To get an idea of how Georgians have been voting for presidents, let's pull up some more voter turnout ratios right now. And here you go. Very good numbers for Democratic presidential candidates in the state of Georgia. Over the last decade, we've seen them not even fall below 120%, where Republicans have not risen above 100%. Basically, what these numbers are telling me is that Georgians are more enthusiastic to vote for Democratic presidential candidates than they are for Democratic House candidates. This is kind of similar to the way that they vote for senators as well, except this is even more extreme. You're much better off as a Democratic presidential candidate in the state of Georgia than you are a Democratic House candidate for a randomly selected district in the state. Both Obama and Hillary Clinton over the last decade did lose the state, but within 10%, a pretty good value for a southern state. A lot of Georgia's neighbors vote by a much wider margins for Republicans. So this is definitely good news for Biden moving forward in the state. This coupled with the fact that raw House turnout is projected to take a pretty dramatic upward turn for Democrats in the state. So let's toss those numbers aside. Lastly, consider the approval rating of the incumbent in this race. It is President Trump. He is currently at -6 points in the state of Georgia right now. He has the approval of 45% and the disapproval of 51%, leaving very little room for that 4% to make much of a difference. And with that, we do have everything we need to calculate who is likely to win the presidential race in Georgia this year. Pollbot, let's calculate that right now. Okay, and there's your result. Wow, we have projected Joe Biden to carry the state of Georgia this year over Donald Trump. Our projections say 6.52% margin of victory in favor of the Democratic candidate. If that holds true, viewers, this would mean that Georgia would vote more decisively for Joe Biden over Donald Trump than either North Carolina or Florida from what we've projected. For a long time now, I've thought that there's a very real possibility that Georgia will vote to the left of both of those states. And I point to, historically how Georgians have elected presidents, how well they performed at the House level in 2018, Trump's negative approval rating. I mean, everything's just working in Joe Biden's favor this year. It's why there's such a dramatic margin of victory in Georgia that we projected for him right here. I would not be shocked at all if it was lower, if he won by less than 6.52%, don't get me wrong, but I would not be shocked either if he won Georgia more decisively than either Florida or North Carolina this year. I can't wait to find out next week. I don't know about you, but Georgia has me very intrigued this year. So let's make this result official now and put it on our presidential map right now. Mark it. So all the election results are now in for the state of Georgia. We've seen a flip in the Senate in the form of the special election. We've seen Joe Biden be the first Democratic presidential candidate in nearly 30 years to carry the state. We've seen one flip in the House as well in favor of Democrats. Let's talk briefly about the future of the state by pulling up an old line graph and two new ones. First, let's talk briefly a bit in more detail about the raw House turnout numbers available for the state of Georgia. Let's look specifically at the slope values that are available in both of those equations there. For Republicans, it is 108.6, and for Democrats, it is 179.7. Basically, what those numbers tell us is that when you take the last decade as a whole, on average, every 2 years, Republicans have gained more votes for Republican House candidates at a rate of 108,600 votes, every 2 years versus Democrats' gain of 179,700 votes every 2 years, meaning that Democrats are catching up. And the only reason they're catching up is because of 2018. I cannot stress enough the importance of that blue wave for Democratic prospects this year. If we had, regular midterm turnout numbers in 2018, certainly then the slope values between parties would be virtually identical, because they did maintain pretty steady margins up until 2018, when it narrowed significantly in favor of Democrats, though they still fell slightly short in raw numbers. And taking a quick look at these other two line graphs here, these are just alternate ways to visualize the advantage that Democratic candidates hold in the state of Georgia at both the senatorial level and the presidential level. And they're so steady too. I mean, their slope values are nearly equal to 0 for Democrats, and we're actually seeing a fall off for Republicans in both categories. In the senatorial category's case, this is very instrumental into our projection of Raphael Warnock taking the seat away from Republicans this year in the special election. However, David Perdue's very good approval rating is enough to overcome this deficit in enthusiasm generally for Republican senatorial candidates. And then looking at presidential numbers, I mean, this is really pushing Biden over the edge, I think. Trump's negative approval rating coupled with figures like these and the massive upward tick in Democratic turnout at the House level is why we have Georgia going more significantly than expected to the left this year at the presidential level. I think Biden is going to carry the state this year. Overall, very good future prospects for Democrats in the state of Georgia. Let's toss all those graphs aside now, and I will give you my final consensus on the state. Georgia is definitely becoming more Democrat. Atlanta and its suburbs are growing fast, and people are more motivated than ever to get out and vote. We saw that in 2018, and it played beautifully into Democrats' hands. Georgia also has a very, very high African-American population, a group of people that tend to skew more to the left than other races. Georgia has been a sleeping giant of massive potential Democratic power that I think started to wake up 2 years ago and will surprise a lot of people this year in how dramatically left it votes compared to previous elections. And that just about does it for our latest episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday. I'm also on Twitter and update that account with which state I'm covering next ahead of the scheduled release date. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter, and that link is in the description. Thanks again for watching. Thank you for voting. See you next time.